Oftentimes when we have users sign up for our application, there's actually more information that we want from them after sign up to create a full profile, for example. So this is an example I've been working on called Potluck Pal with a few of my partners' technologies. And you go through the process to sign in, and I can use my email and it will send me a confirmation code that I can enter in here. This will redirect me back to the application. And at this point, I want the user to complete their profile. So I actually gate the rest of these pages to make sure that they finish adding a name and a username, because this is going to be essential for how we add people to an event or request that people bring things in this example. So you can tell if I go to the My Events tab, this is going to redirect back to the Profile tab. If I go to create an event, it redirects back here as well. So we want to make sure that users have their profile created before we allow them to get through. Now inside of here, I also have a neat little feature that I might do a separate video on, kind of this loading indicator to choose whether or not a username is available, that I think is pretty cool. So after we create this profile, what this will do is save this in the database, and then we'd be able to come over to the form for creating an event as well. So I'll probably have a few additional videos on how to create this multi-step form, which I found to be very complicated, to be quite honest. But I want to focus on the user profile and onboarding experience. So basically the idea of letting a user sign up, but then also gating pages until they finish the necessary information that you want. Now you'll find some mixed reviews on how exactly this should work. Typically what people agree on is you should make the sign up process as easy as possible. And then you should let some of the smaller details get figured out later if they're not necessary. In this case, since we need to have those profile pieces of information, the name and the username, we're going to make those required, but we'll let the sign up process happen with just email using Kind, and then take over the user profile information associated with that user after that. So what we're going to use is Next.js 14 with the app router. I've actually got a demo project set up that I'll show you in a second. And then we're going to use Kind for authentication. Kind is actually the sponsor of this video. So the first time working with Kind, but it's worked really well as we'd expect inside of Next.js. You'll see that in a second. And then Zeta for a database to actually store the user profile. And we'll talk about why that's separate from the actual user in Kind in a minute. So let's take a look at the starter code that I have, or actually probably be easier to just show you this running. So this is running at localhost 3001. And I basically have a copy of the front end design, which I think these cards are pretty cool. And then what we're going to do is come in and add the sign in functionality. And then we're going to add all the other functionality for the user profile. And then we'll actually save that information into our database. So the first thing we'll want to do is go into Kind, and you can log in for a free account. So I'll go ahead and log in with my GitHub account. And after you've logged in, you'll be taken to your dashboard. And you can see I basically have one application here, which is what I've been working on with Potluck Pal. So I'm going to add a completely brand new application, and we'll call this user profile demo. And this will be considered a backend web application. So we'll go ahead and create that. And then inside of here, we're going to create a Next.js project. So it's interesting that this is referenced as backend. Interesting because Next.js can do front end and backend, and actually doing authentication on the front end and the backend is actually a pretty tricky topic. But I'm going to choose Next.js in here, and then we'll save this. And this will give us a couple of different properties that we can use. You should actually just press set on both of those variables, but we'll come back and fix that in a minute. So I'm going to copy the callback URL and the logout URL. Basically, where do we want to send the user with the callback after they logged in, and then where do we want to send the user after they've logged out. They have a starter kit. We're going to start from scratch here, which is okay. And then I'm just going to copy all of these into my environment variable file. So a couple of things that it has the client ID, which is the ID for the specific application that we're creating, has a client secret hidden until copied. That's nice. Then it has the issuer URL, which is basically the domain on Kind that we redirect to actually handle the login process. Have our site URL, and then we have where do we want the user to go after logout and after login. So we can copy this entire thing, and we can create a new file inside of the root called .env, and we'll just paste all of these credentials in. So it's nice that they just give all of these to us. And then I'm going to go to the Next.js SDK docs. So that was basically the docs if you're starting with their starter code. In this case, we're starting from scratch basically. So let's go ahead and we will install this package. So the Kind OSS, Kind Auth Next.js. And then we'll need to copy in this URL to be a known URL that they can redirect back to from Kind. So we're going to put that in the callback URLs, and then we're going to put the localhost 3000 in for the logout redirect URL. Now, obviously, these are URLs that you're going to need to update when you actually have a deployed application. But inside of your project details, just make sure that you save that so Kind can actually redirect successfully. Then we have our environment variables. We already did this. So we have the client ID, the secret, the issuer URL, the site URL, and then the 2 redirect URLs. So we should have all the information copied. The Kind audience is not required. This is if you're wanting to confirm JWT or access tokens that they're coming to the intended audience, which in this case, we're not getting into. So we add all those credentials, and then basically we have like 2 lines to set up auth. And this is actually really neat. So inside of app, we're going to create API/auth. So inside of the app directory, so app, and then we'll have a new folder and we'll do API/auth. And then this route name here, actually could have copied this whole thing. That's okay. And inside of here, we'll create a new file and we'll do a dynamic route with Kind auth in there. And basically what this is going to do is allow Kind, this should be a TypeScript file as well, is allow Kind to handle multiple different API endpoints, basically for login, logout, etc., which is pretty handy. And then we will import the handle auth from their package, and then we'll just export handle auth. And this is all it takes to basically have authentication set up inside of Next.js, where we have environment variables, and then this is all the configuration of the SDK. So really, really not too bad. Now we can go ahead and run this application just to make sure it's running again. So let's go back to the running one. I think this is on 3.0.1, and this should be good to go. So nothing's changed. Now we can start to get into the nav bar, and I already have some code stubbed out here. It's basically just design. It has the image in here. It also has state for user and loading, which we aren't really tracking yet. Now, if you wanted to follow along with this source code, you can actually check out the source code for the original project in here. So I will make sure to push all this code, all the original code for the Potluck demo, so you can have this as a reference if you want to, and I'll include a link in the description below. But let's start with actually getting a reference to some components that we can use for login and logout. All right, so then we're going to import a few different things from this Kind package. Now, specifically, we're going to import the login link, the logout link, and those are probably pretty self-explanatory. And then also a use hook that we can use on the front end, specifically to gain access to the user itself. So we can actually get the user from that hook and a loading state to see whether or not we're loading, determining whether or not we have a user. So we're going to import all of these things, and this is going to come from the Kind OSS Next.js package. And inside of here, we're going to get the login link, the log out link. See, we're getting good IntelliSense there. And then the use Kind browser client. Now, this is a little bit wordy, but I actually like that they named this because Next.js authentication can be really tricky considering you can do things on the front end and the back end. So inside of here, instead of hard coding these 2 properties, user and is loading, we can actually get these directly from this client. So this hook, use Kind browser client, we can grab those 2 properties and actually reference them there. So we can get rid of these hard-coded values, and then we can reference them down below. Now, the other thing we're going to do is uncomment the logout link. Again, this is just logout link component that we put the text logout in. Nothing really we have to do there. I have that wrapped in an LI so that it can be styled the way I want. And the last thing is we'll uncomment this section, which is basically a check to say, hey, if we don't have a user and we're not loading, so we fully confirm the user is not logged in, show the sign in link or login link. So you can call that whatever you want. So again, these 2 components are given to us. We don't have to do anything for them other than, in this case, I wrap them with an LI so I could style them the way I want. The last thing just to mention to make sure is the routes or the navbar links that are for a logged in user are only shown if we actually have a user and we're finished loading. So let's save that and let's just see what we have. Now, I just restarted this application to make sure that this current version is running on localhost 3000. I had the original version on 3000, but then my callback URLs and things were localhost 3000. So now I'm making sure the one that I'm working on is the one that I'm running, and it is at localhost 3000. So let's go and now just refresh localhost 3000 so we can get the current page. And we should see there was a little bit of a delay as it's loading to check the state of the logged in user. You see there's no logged in user, so now we see the sign in button. So now we can go through and sign in, and it says we don't have a way to authenticate you at the moment. And this is because inside of our project, we actually need to configure what type of authentication we're going to allow. So in this case, you can choose password list where they send you a code to your email or a password. And I'm going to choose to do password list. And it's worth noting that you can also add authentication for social providers as well. So this is done at the tenant level. So if you go back to your tenant and then go into settings, you can come into authentication. And then here you can see where you have your social connections and enterprise connections that you can enable. If you scroll through, you'll see a bunch that you recognize: Discord and Facebook, GitHub, etc. So just wanted to call out that there's other options that you can use for your login experience as well. So by the time we come back to our local host, and then we click the sign in, we should now be redirected to a page where we can actually go through this login process. And I'll go through the same thing you saw at the beginning of the video, where I'll grab this token out of my email, put it in here. It will redirect us back to the application. Now, if you remember back to our onboarding and the environment variables that we copied in, there was a post login redirect URL, and this is set to /dashboard, which is why after we log in, it redirects us back to the actual dashboard route. All right, so I've got that code. I'll push continue. And it should now take us back to the application. In this case, it's redirecting back to the dashboard page where we don't really have anything there yet. So you can see that we have access to the dashboard. We have no events yet. And then we also have access to the create an event tab. But this is where we want to stop the user from getting to this place if they haven't actually completed their onboarding profile, meaning their name and their username. So in this case, we want to be able to store this user profile inside of a Zeta database. This is what we're going to use for our database. Another partner of mine that I've worked a ton with. You can see a bunch of different demos in here. So this is completely free. You can set up. It runs Postgres underneath the hood. I'll have more content actually on using this with Prisma in the future, but for now, we're going to use the Zeta TypeScript SDK. So what we'll do is create a new database, and we'll call this user profile demo. And in this case, I won't enable the direct Postgres, although it's something that I would recommend doing and using this with Prisma. It's pretty exciting, actually, that we can do this. I just haven't updated this demo for that yet. So inside of here, we just want to have one table, basically, and we're going to have the user profile table. Now, there's kind of an open question of if you want to store additional properties of a user, where would you store those? And so like other auth providers, you actually have the ability to store like custom properties inside of Kind as well. But in this case, we're going to store them in our own database. And my thought is this is going to be slightly more convenient and wrapped around or accessed in a similar way that we will get all of our other data. So Kind will be the source of truth for all of our user login information, specifically storing passwords, keys, tokens, etc. And then we'll store additional information inside of our own database so we have complete control over this. Now, the way we're going to do this, though, is we're going to have the ID of the user profile match up with the ID of the user from Kind. That way, when we get a user ID from the user in Kind, we can use that as a reference to pull in the user profile from Zeta. And actually, I slightly misspoke. We'll have the ID in here be auto-generated by Zeta, and then we'll reference the user ID, and that's what we're actually going to query by. So we'll have the user ID property is a string, and it will be unique. So we'll make sure we'll only have one profile per user. So we'll have the user ID that we can do our associations with. We'll also have the user name. These will also be unique. And then lastly, we'll have the actual name of the user. So we'll put that in there as well. All right, so that's all the setup in the database that we actually need. Now we need to actually reference this inside of our code. So to do this, we'll need to install the Zeta client. So let's just take a look at the Zeta client. So this is Zeta SDK for TypeScript and JavaScript. You can go to the details here on their documentation page. And what we'll need to do is actually install that client, but we'll also need to connect Zeta to our application. So what we'll do is you would run a Zeta login for the first time you're doing this, and it'll set up a token behind the scenes, etc. I've already done that, so I can just run Zeta init. And then it's going to ask us basically which project do we want to attach this to. And I want to attach this to the user profile demo. And then we can add the .env to the .getignore. It's going to ask us what sort of code do you want it to return. In this case, we say TypeScript. Where do we want that to go? We can put it by default in source zeta.ts. And then what's really cool is this will give us our API key. So you can see reference in here. It created the API key in our .env file, and then also referenced a Zeta branch as main. So you can have multiple branches in Zeta to separate your database tables based on like branches or like GitHub branches or environments or whatever you want to do there. The other thing that it generated is the Zeta.ts file. And you can see inside of here is where it defines the table that actually came from the table inside of Zeta. And then it uses some TypeScript inference to actually generate types for us that we can use. And then lastly, has a reference to the actual database itself. So this is all pretty cool, all set up for us. And now we have a fully typed TypeScript SDK that we can use to interact with all of our data. So the first thing we want to do is go into our dashboard page, and notice we're not really doing anything inside of here. So let's actually do the first level of a check. The first check is just to see if we have a logged in user. So we know we don't want the user to be able to to access the dashboard if they're not already logged in. So we can import get the get user function from, and then we have a function get kind server session. My auto import for this is a little bit off. So this is not going to come from dist. It's going to come from the server. So there's the import for this function. This needs to be inside of an async function so we can await this. Now these can be async because we're using React server components by default in Next.js 14. And so we get this get user function, and then we can call this to actually get the user. So we can say the user is going to come from awaiting the call to the get user function. Now, lastly, we know if we don't have a user, we don't want them to access the dashboard. So if we don't have a user, we can then just run a redirect. So we can get a redirect from Next navigation, I believe, and we will just redirect them to the home page. We could redirect them to sign in or something else. In this case, we'll just start with the home page and just kind of kick them out. So we can run our application again and just see if this is running. Now, again, the next step is to make sure they have a profile, which adds some additional logic. But for now, this should just navigate the user away if they're not actually logged in. So if we go back to my events is the /dashboard page. And just to show you this, we can go to /dashboard. So there's the route for dashboard. We're able to get here. If we were to log out, what we want to check is if we try to manually go to the dashboard route, it should just go there and then redirect the user back. So we're successfully checking to make sure that a user has to be logged in to actually get to their dashboard. Now I'm going to go through that sign in process again so we can continue to test our signed in user workflow. All right, so I'm back and signed in. Now the next thing we want to do is actually check to see if there is a user profile associated with this user. So this is where we're going to start to integrate with Zeta. And what we're going to do is we're going to get a reference to the Zeta client. So this is going to come from the get Zeta client function. So that thing is going to be imported from that Zeta.ts file that was just generated for us. And that's going to give us access to the Zeta client that we can make queries with. And then what we'll do is we will await our client.db. And then notice in here, it gives us IntelliSense for the tables that we can work with, which is pretty neat. And then we can call a filter. And what do we want to filter by? We want to filter by the user ID property where it matches the user ID of the logged in user. So we can get a reference to that ID by destructuring it or just getting it from the user. So from the logged in user in kind, we want to grab its unique identifier, and we're going to use that as our filter to look inside of our Zeta database. Now from here, after the filter, we just want to get the first. So there should only be one of these. We just want to get the first of them, and we can alias this in TypeScript to a user profile record. And again, this is coming from that Zeta code that was generated for us, the user profile record here, which has all the properties of the user that we tracked, and we can see this inside of here. So all of these properties, it also has a combination of a Zeta record, which Zeta has created at, updated at, etc. So this is going to give us all the information for that user profile that we would want. So in here, we'll just see and call this user profile. And then additionally, now is where we actually want to check if this user profile doesn't exist. We could do the same thing and actually redirect this user away. But in this case, we specifically want to redirect the user not to the home page, but to the create profile page. And you can see that we have a route for this already created, which is the create profile page. Now inside of here, there's a lot of work already done inside of the create profile form. So actually skip over this. If you want to see this more in depth, I could do a separate video on this, but I don't think it's the most necessary part of this part. But basically what we have is a relatively simple form in here that has a spot for name and then for username. Now the couple of things that get a little complicated is being able to do the check with the username. So checking the availability and using some debouncing to make sure we're not making too many API requests to the backend to check the availability of that username while it's actually being typed. All right, so the majority of that code is handled for us. Now what we want to do is just look inside of the code that we were working on and just check if we don't have a user profile, then we actually want to do our redirect. So we can use the same redirect function that we used before, and then we'll redirect to the create profile page. Now we'll actually move this code a little bit here in a second, and we'll see why we can take advantage of layouts in Next.js versus just pages. But for now, let's just see if this works. So if we come back to the application and refresh on our dashboard page, we should see that we get redirected to the create your profile page. And again, this has the information already ready to handle the loading state and the checking for the username. Now, the way this is working for the username is it's just doing a query inside of this user profile table with Zeta to see if that username already exists inside of the database. Now, again, it also does some debouncing to make sure it's not sending a request every time something changes on the input. It has a delay, I think, of 500 milliseconds. We can actually see the delay inside of here if we go and look. So we have a debounced username input handler, and it takes a debounce of 500 milliseconds. And you could obviously configure this to be whatever you want. Again, let me know if you want a full video on how to do like a live feedback username checker. But for now, we'll just take advantage of the fact that this is done for us. So inside of this dashboard page, if there is no user profile, we want to redirect to the actual create profile page. Now, the one additional thing we could do inside of this page is check to see whether or not this profile does exist by the time we get here. So what if someone manually tries to go to the create profile page? Well, we don't want that to happen either. So we can actually kind of copy the same exact thing that we just did. And in the final code, I have this in a separate function. But we could copy this exact same code and tweak it just a little bit. So we can get all of our imports. We want the Zeta client in Zeta, and then we want the user profile record from Zeta as well. And we'll say almost the opposite of these. We'll get the user from kind, and then we'll just leave this and say redirect away if there is no user. From there, we'll query for the user profile, and then now we'll say if there is a user profile, then we'll redirect back to the dashboard page, which is /dashboard. So in this case, if they already have a profile, they don't need to be on the create profile page. We'll just redirect them back to the dashboard page. And again, this only gets triggered if they try to manually type in /create-profile after already creating their profile. So we have this check on the dashboard page, but we also want to apply this to the new event. So right now, this is a multi-step form. And so step one is that new event /step one. So if we wanted to check on each one of the 3 steps that the user does have a profile, we'd have to copy that into 3 additional pages with the exact same code. Thankfully, though, we have access to, under the dashboard, we have a layout. And inside of the layout component, we can already add our check to make sure there is a user and redirect them if there is not one. That means if they try to go to any page inside of /dashboard, either /dashboard or /dashboard/new event /step-1, etc., it'll handle that redirect. From here, we can just replicate, or actually just move this profile code over into the layout, and it'll take care of all of those checks for us. So again, we'll update all of our imports from Zeta here to get our client and our profile record. And now at the layout level, before we even let them get to any of the children routes, we check the user profile to make sure it exists, and if not, redirect them to the create profile. So this means if I try to go to dashboard, it should redirect. If I try to go to /dashboard/new event, it will redirect. And then if I try to go to any of those individual steps, so I could go to /dashboard/new event /step-1, and that should redirect. And I can do that for step 2 and 3 as well. So this is how you can protect individual pages from a user that has not completed their onboarding profile. Now, I would recommend thinking through what are the things inside of here that are actually required. In my case, to be able to create an event and to participate in events, you have to have a name and a username, which makes both of these required before they can go to any of those other pages. But you may have additional things like preferences that are not required for the user, but would be useful to have. So in that case, I would end up creating a /preferences or /profile page where the user can go and update any of their preferences as they need to, so they're not bogged down so they're not slowed down from actually using the application because they haven't filled out information that's not even necessary for them to participate. So always think about what pieces of data are actually required for the user and what pieces of data could you let them take care of kind of whenever they're ready or never if they don't need to. So there's a lot to think about in a Next.js world, on the client, on the server, using server components, server actions, etc. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of how to handle an onboarding workflow for your users using Next.js 14 and all the other things that come along with it. If you're interested in learning how to build this entire application, I'm thinking about turning this into a mini course. So if you want to follow along, you can follow my newsletter at jquick.com and then scroll down to the footer to subscribe and get updates on a weekly basis. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll catch you next time.